I would like to introduce our moderator for the evening. I'm sure probably does not need much introduction to this audience. Gloria Ladson-Billings is the Kellner Family Professor of Urban Education in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction here at Madison. She is also an affiliate in EPS and Assistant Vice Chancellor of Academic Affairs. She has a renowned record of teaching research and service on issues in urban education and modern American education, and some of her works are for sale in the back of the room. Finally, at the end of the evening, books by all of our speakers are on sale, and they will be available for signing. And there are free posters of Barbara Miner's photographs that are also available for the first 10 or 12 people who purchase her book. So please, Gloria, thank you.
Thank you, Mark, and good evening. Okay, yeah, I am used to people answering back. I can't help myself. We're delighted that you are all here this evening. I'm not going to take much of your time because we have two wonderful speakers. But I want to say in terms of prefatory words, is that there's probably no phrase that is more widely uttered when we talk about education these days than achievement gap. Everybody's talking about it. And I want to point out to you that they're not just talking about it here in America. We tend to be a nation of navel gazers. We think, oh, it's all about us. But I can tell you that this is a worldwide phenomenon. Why are some students doing well, and why are some students not doing well? And that why is it so predictable? Not that sort of randomly some kids do well and some kids don't do well, but it's very predictable in most places. I went last month to Stockholm, Sweden, and while there I spent most of my time in what they call newcomer schools, schools that are serving immigrant children from around the world. And when you walk into those schools and those classrooms, it's almost like reading the New York Times. Every hot spot in the world was represented: Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Iran, Syria, Greece. So here are these kids from everywhere, and they're struggling. There are, I think, some really important reasons for why they're struggling that have to do with globalization, the movement of capital around the world, and the fact that neoliberal ideas are popping up everywhere. So it's not merely the U.S. that is coping with this phenomenon that we call the achievement gap. This evening, we are really, really fortunate to have two outstanding writers, researchers, thinkers about schools. Our first speaker is going to be Barbara Miner. I think I've known Barbara and of her work since I first arrived in Wisconsin, actually before I arrived in Wisconsin, because I was reading Rethinking Schools in California. Barbara was the managing editor of Rethinking Schools. And her book on lessons learned is really a kind of zeroing in on the Milwaukee story. For those of you who don't know, when we talk about things like Afrocentric schools or male academies, Milwaukee was doing this and talking about this in the late 1980s. It's one of the first school districts that began to have this conversation. I remember reading in California an article that talked about, well, isn't that going to make the schools segregated? And the black community in Milwaukee said, duh, we are already in segregated schools. And so Barbara has had a laser-like focus on what Milwaukee has been all about. And in her wonderful book, she really gives us a historical context for understanding how things like choice and charters have emerged in Milwaukee. Our second speaker is Sarah Carr, and even though Sarah is in New Orleans now, she has a Milwaukee connection. Sarah used to work for the Milwaukee Sentinel Journal-Sentinel, I never get that straight. But she moved to New Orleans to work for the New Orleans Times-Picayune. She is a Spencer postdoctoral fellow for the journalism program. She is a wonderful writer. And again, in her new book, Hope Against Hope, she's begun to look at what has happened to New Orleans schools, the so-called miracle that was supposed to be proclaimed because New Orleans is the one big city district that had a chance to start all over. So I know this is going to be a wonderful evening. I don't want to take up any more time because I want you to hear from both of these scholars. So we're going to start with Barbara Minor.
Thank you, Gloria. And I'm short, so I need to adjust these things. And for those who may not be aware, but Gloria is a legend in her time, as they say. Now, I speak to you today as a journalist, as the parent of 2 children who attended the Milwaukee Public Schools, and as a Wisconsinite who graduated from here at UW-Madison. I spent many, many a week at the bottom of Vilas Hall working at the Daily Cardinal. Now, when I tell people I'm from Milwaukee, I often notice a vague look in the eye, and I can almost see their mind at work as they go, Milwaukee, beer, brats, the Fonz. And if they follow education, they might say, don't you have that school choice movement? And although they may not say so aloud, and all those horrible failing schools, and I cringe, but not for the reasons you might think. I cringe because I refuse to use the term school choice, and I refuse to use the term failing schools. What we have in Milwaukee is not defined by choice and failing schools. What we have is abandonment, hyper-segregation, disenfranchisement, and privatized, consumer-based solutions to very, very complex social problems. Now, I'd like to begin reading from the book with a story about a so-called failing school, and it involves Gwen Moore, who in 2004 became the first African American from Wisconsin elected to the U.S. Congress. When Gwen Moore walked into Milwaukee's North Division High School in September 1965 on her first day, she was terrified. North was seen as this horrible place, she explains, all black, segregated, inferior. Moore had wanted to attend West Division High School, a, quote, white school closer to home. But when she tried to register at West, school officials told her she had to go to North. My mom was in Texas at a Baptist convention, and I talked to her and I said, Mom, they wouldn't let me go to West, Moore tells the story. Gerrymandering, her mom muttered. Jerry who, Moore said. Never mind, go on to North, and when I get back, we'll straighten this out. Moore laughs at the story's irony, because by the time her mother returned, she had fallen in love with North Division. Now, Moore had always been proud to be black, but as a child, she'd felt the stigma of poverty. Not at North, however. No one looked down on her because she didn't have the right clothes or hairdo, or because her skin color was especially dark. People appreciated me for being intelligent, she explains. Finding both acceptance and courage, Moore learned that she had leadership skills. When she talked, students listened. Along with several other Milwaukee high schools at the time, North was a center of black pride. Moore remembers in particular a social studies teacher who talked with students about the contributions of Malcolm X, H. Rap Brown, Bobby Seale, and Martin Luther King. Moore loved the discussions, and she became involved with student-led walkouts demanding textbooks reflecting the contributions of African Americans. Today, Moore cannot say enough good about her time at North Division, and she uses her personal experience to underscore that no school should ever be judged merely by test scores or by its reputation in the media. North ended up being one of the best experiences I ever had, Moore says. In terms of social development and leadership skills, North was the most significant part of my life. Now, there's an interesting epilogue to this story. Moore was a state representative here in Madison when the voucher program first passed in 1990, and public tax dollars were used to pay the tuition at private schools. The program was small, it was secular, and it was considered an experiment. Moore voted in favor. That is a vote I deeply regret, she says, because I allowed vouchers and then I saw what it came to be. I never was the kind of person who wanted to destroy public education. Now, for many years, I've reported on Milwaukee's abandonment, not just of public schools, but of entire neighborhoods and communities. And in the last week, I've spoken in Washington, D.C., New York, Philadelphia. People are deeply worried about their neighborhoods, about the massive closing of public schools and the replacement with charters, and about gentrification as whites discover once again that cities can be cool places to live. Over and over, this is what people told me, that we need to start connecting the dots city by city, and that caring for our children, caring for our community, and caring for our democracy, it's all part of a single vision. Now, in writing the book, one of the questions I faced was where to start, where to end, how to organize the book. So I start in 1957, when the Milwaukee Braves defeated the New York Yankees, or as we in Milwaukee like to call them, those stuck-up East Coast think they're better than us New York Yankees, and Milwaukee won the World Series. Equally important, the factories were humming and hopes were high. As Hank Aaron noted, life didn't get much better than Milwaukee in 1957. I end with the protests in Madison in 2011, when Governor Scott Walker not only passed Act 10, but also cut public education more than any governor in Wisconsin history. Now, the book is called Lessons from the Heartland, so a lot of people expect an easy list, 1, 2, 3, of what those lessons might be. But as I note in the introduction, it's not quite that simple. In this era of standardized tests, the tendency is to look for a single correct answer. But the lessons of Milwaukee cannot be approached as a multiple choice quiz. Milwaukee's plight, as is true in so many other American cities, is rooted in complex and interdependent issues of housing, jobs, and schools, all of which are shaped by race and class. Now, one issue may dominate at a particular moment. Milwaukee's most sustained civil rights protests focused on housing discrimination. But over time, housing, jobs, and schools have worked together as the most important mechanisms for reproducing inequality and for challenging inequality. Among these issues, public education plays a unique role. Now, 50 years ago, no one, I guarantee it, no one would have predicted that Milwaukee's educational claim to fame would be its school voucher program, the country's oldest and largest, and a conservative model for similar initiatives. Now, all politics is local, but with national repercussions. The Milwaukee story is the Wisconsin story, is the nation's story. And I keep returning to the question, what happened? How did Milwaukee fall so far from grace? Will it find redemption in the 21st century? And more important, what does this iconic city in America's heartland tell us about the future of public education in the United States and our vision of democracy in a multicultural society? Now, the book has 25 chapters organized in 3 sections. Part 1 is segregation, prosperity, and protests, the 1950s and 1960s. Part 2, desegregation, deindustrialization, and backlash, the 1970s and 1980s. Part 3, resegregation, abandonment, and a new era of protests, the 1990s and 2000s. Now, one of the questions people ask me is whether there was an aha moment in the book when I realized something new. And there were several. One was the realization that the attempt to desegregate Milwaukee's schools, which began in 1976, completely overlapped with deindustrialization. At the very time Milwaukee's public schools were attempting their most difficult transformation ever, the city's economy fell apart. The African American community was especially affected. Another aha moment involved the link between the rhetoric of choice and the rhetoric of failing schools and how both are being used to undermine public education. It is seductive and powerful rhetoric. Now, a concept as American as apple pie, individual choice, has long been considered a component of liberty, correctly so. In education, used appropriately, it can and should help ensure that public schools are sensitive to the varying needs of students, families, and communities. But just as the term states' rights was code in the 1960s for opposing federal civil rights legislation, today, choice has become code. It has become code for initiatives that funnel public tax dollars into private voucher schools and privately run charters. It is code for reforms based on markets and individual decisions by consumers. And one of the lessons from Milwaukee is that over time, the emphasis on individual choice has undermined the collective choice of public schools that serve all children. And interestingly, before the mid-1990s, the term failing schools, it basically did not exist. It certainly was never applied to Jim Crow schools in the South that could not even afford desks. After the election of George W. Bush and the bipartisan passage of NCLB, the failing schools label reached new heights, applied to schools and districts alike. Along with choice, it became part of the established educational lexicon. Now, when looking at today's problems, one thing I can guarantee you, the way forward is not clear. Issues are very complicated. Now, here in Wisconsin, the land of Scott Walker and Paul Ryan, we understand this. But we are also from a state that re-elected President Obama, and equally important, elected as our U.S. Senator Tammy Baldwin, a strong progressive and a proud lesbian. There's another issue from Milwaukee that I don't believe is overly complicated, and that is the need to defend the institution of public education, a commitment so fundamental that it is enshrined in every state constitution in the country. At the same time, and this is equally important, we must acknowledge and do something about the fact that too many public schools are just plain lousy. Now, more than 2 decades ago, in 1990, Milwaukee's power brokers decided they'd rather abandon the public schools than fix them. So we became the first city in the country with the voucher program. Milwaukee was also the first city in the country in 1998 in which the city's Common Council could set up charter schools independent of the school district and independent of the locally elected school board. These charters in Milwaukee operate at the margins of public oversight and democratic control. And they become the preferred entree for what I call the McFranchise charter chains. Across the country, these McFranchise charters, publicly funded, privately run, cookie-cutter models, they're on a growth spurt. Now, as we talk about charters, an important caveat, and Sarah, I know, has a very good explanation of this, because I heard it at a radio program before we came. Not all charters are the same, and charter schools come in many shapes and sizes. Charter schools, in fact, have their roots among progressive educators who wanted to experiment. The charters were part of the school district, and the idea was to strengthen the connection between school community and to use the lessons learned to improve all public schools. Fortunately, such charters still exist and remain a strong force. Unfortunately, the charter movement has become the darling of conservative ideologues, entrepreneurs who see a big pot of money in education, and elites who too often think they're smarter and better than the rest of us. They all chafe at public control, and they now dominate the charter movement. Now, the Milwaukee public schools are certainly not above criticism. In fact, I guarantee it, I could outline a better critique than Scott Walker. But I also know that at the end of the day, the Milwaukee Public Schools is the only educational institution in the city with the capacity, the commitment, and the legal obligation to serve all children. There's another essential lesson from Milwaukee, and that is the continuing importance of race. Now, in Milwaukee, we don't talk about race. Even though our segregation is so intense, we've had to coin a new phrase, hypersegregation. And this hypersegregation, well, it's like the air, ever present, but seemingly invisible. Thus, we pretend we live in a post-racial society, and that's absurd. And one of the many questions I ask myself is, Why are students of color in urban cities, why are they the guinea pigs for private vouchers and McFranchise charters? Because if these reforms are so terrific, why aren't rich white people in the suburbs clamoring for them? Now, before I continue, another important aside, and that is, I never criticize parents for their decisions about schools, because life is difficult. And parents do what parents are supposed to do. They advocate for their child. But I do criticize policymakers because they have a different responsibility. It's their job to balance the competing interests of parents and develop policies that protect the rights of all children. Now, from the beginning, vouchers have been a classic example of bait and switch. And I'd like to read a selection from the book that speaks to this. David Barrett was editorial page editor at the Milwaukee Journal during the 1990s. As is customary in the media, certain people's phone calls bypass the secretary and go straight to influential editors. In 1990, when the voucher controversy was first surfacing in Milwaukee, Barrett got a call from a, quote, prominent Milwaukee business executive who wanted to speak off the record. Years later, this is how Barrett explains that call. He said some well-connected powers that be had concluded that it was finally time to pump taxpayer dollars into the Catholic schools because that was the only way to save them. The push would be framed as an effort to help impoverished black children get a better education, but saving the Catholic schools was the driving force. Now, Milwaukee's voucher program started small. As I said, 340 students at 7 schools. Today, it involves almost 25,000 students at 112 schools. 85% of those students attend religious schools. In size, Milwaukee's voucher program is almost equal to the Madison School District, which is the state's second largest. Yet here's the catch. Even if every single student at that voucher school receives a publicly funded voucher, the school is still defined as private. So for more than 20 years, voucher schools have been a conservative's dream. No teacher unions, no government bureaucracy, no curricular restrictions, the ability to kick out students at will. In 2010, for the first time, voucher schools had to publicly release their test scores. The results? The voucher schools performed about the same as the public schools in reading, noticeably worse in math. When special ed students were taken into account, the voucher schools did significantly worse in both reading and math. Milwaukee, as we're learning, however, was merely a softening up, as it were. In Wisconsin, Walker has taken the logical next steps of the voucher agenda. On top of significant changes 2 years ago, this year's budget expands vouchers across the state, and he also calls for an appointed board to promote privately run charters outside of the local school boards. He also has higher payments for vouchers, but funding is flat for public schools. Even Republicans are balking. So I'd like to finish with a story from the book about a young man who graduated from the Milwaukee Public Schools a few years ago, and today is an activist for immigrant rights. The story is a reminder that if one wants to find hope, energy, resilience, and God knows we need hope, energy, and resilience, my advice is go visit a school. Get your nose out of a book, although hopefully not Sarah or mine's, and go visit a school. Talk to real students and real teachers in real time. So I'd like to tell you the story of Dennis, he's just this great guy. I mean, like I say, I just love talking to the students, when in doubt. Dennis Rodriguez left Veracruz, Mexico in 2002. He was 11 years old and did not speak a word of English. More problematic, neither he, his mother, his father, nor his younger brother had legal papers. Now, Rodriguez, with the confidence of youth, he's decided he will not live in fear, and he refuses to hide his undocumented status. Fear is a mind killer, he says. Rodriguez didn't always feel that way. While at South Division High School, he and many of his friends thought there was little reason to do well academically because an undocumented person had little future. One day, however, he walked past a book sale sponsored by the school librarian. That book sale changed his life. Rodriguez was an avid reader, and his bilingual classes in middle and high school had allowed him to maintain his Spanish while learning English. I'm kind of nerdy, Rodriguez admits, so I was excited when I saw the book sale. I asked the librarian, what would be good to read? She pointed to one book, explaining it was by a psychologist, Viktor Frankl, talking about his experiences in the Holocaust. I pick up Frankl's book, and underneath there's a book with a bright orange cover and this guy with wild hair and crazy darting eyes. The librarian said the book was by Nietzsche. She wasn't sure if she should recommend it because she knew it would be hard to read. Oh, but that cover was so eye-catching. The books were only a couple of dollars, so Rodriguez bought them. It took me forever to get through the books, especially Nietzsche, he says, but they made me realize that I don't have to settle for what is here and now. I can build my own life. I mean, here's Frankl, this man who lost so much and went through so much suffering. Those books were a life changer. So, and I oftentimes end with Dennis's story because, again, I just find it such hope and energy and commitment. But we're here in Madison, so I figured it would be appropriate to end with a quote from Fightin' Bob La Follette. He's inspired Wisconsinites for more than a century. 2 years ago, in particular, he was a touchstone for the best of Wisconsin's traditions. Now, La Follette saw people not as passive participants in democracy, but as partners in a movement to more equitably distribute the nation's power and wealth. Quote, mere passive citizenship, it's not enough, he said. Men must be aggressive for what is right, if government is to be saved from men who are aggressive for what is wrong. So on that note, we have a wonderful speaker, Sarah, and I don't know, Gloria, if you're going to be doing a in-between, but thank you very much.
Let's see. Those are two tough acts to follow. First, thanks to you all for coming out tonight. I'm excited to see that there's so many people with an interest in this topic. You know, as Gloria noted, I have worked as an education reporter in both Milwaukee and in New Orleans. And as it happens at both newspapers, I wrote a series of articles following families of different races and classes and educational levels and language fluencies through the process of finding schools for their children. And my intent in doing these stories was to show how these variables influenced families' capacity to access the schools that they wanted. And what I found most disturbing when I finished the stories was that there really weren't any surprises. Middle-class families and parents with cars and parents with flexible schedules, with professional connections, and with the time and background to navigate bureaucracies access the best schools. And the low-income families whose parents worked 70 hours a week to make ends meet, who didn't have the time or transportation to make it to information sessions and had no high-powered connections or experience navigating sort of complicated bureaucracies, ended up in the schools that they didn't want in most cases. And I point this out to underscore that I feel like what we've created in New Orleans and Milwaukee isn't so much choice as a marketplace with the inherent winners and losers and ultimate inequity that comes from a marketplace approach. But just to complicate this a little bit, I think that at times the traditional education structure is equally complicit in its protection of free markets. Even if vouchers and charters and other forms of choice are what we most readily associate with an educational marketplace, but with the disparate resources being spent on public schools depending on where you are, and with the ways in which money and power allow for the privileged and often the privileged alone to have choice, including the choice to opt out, within the traditional system, I think being too critical of charters and vouchers solely on the grounds that they create an educational marketplace can be hypocritical because we're de facto protecting a public education structure that has preserved and reinforced existing class structures and inequities with remarkable fidelity for years. So what I think we really need is choice for the most disempowered, which I believe would really be tantamount to revolution in this country, because it would require privileging the perspectives and aspirations of precisely those who've been the least privileged in these conversations, those who the elites on all sides, I believe, mistakenly purport to speak for a lot of the time. My book was really an attempt to humanize the story of contemporary school reform. I followed a low-income family, a young teacher, and a veteran principal as they navigated their ways through the post-Katrina school landscape. And in selecting the characters, I tried to pick ones whose perspectives and life experiences were different from each other and from my own. The other day, I was finishing journalist Catherine Boo's book called Behind the Beautiful Forevers, which tells the story of a group of impoverished families living in a Mumbai slum. And in her author's note, she tries to explain why she chose to focus on ordinary people rather than broader policy debates or history. And she wrote something that I think summarizes what I hope to do in Hope Against Hope better than I ever could. She wrote, "When I settle into a place, listening and watching, I don't try to fool myself that the stories of individuals are themselves arguments. I just believe that better arguments and maybe even better policies get formulated when we know more about ordinary lives." And I hoped in writing this book to help tip the balance a little bit so that in this country, people's life experiences will help shape rhetoric a little more than rhetoric shapes their lives. Speaking of rhetoric, I think as many of you know, there are sort of two broad narratives that have arisen around school reform, charters, and post-Katrina New Orleans education in the last 5 years. According to the first narrative, school choice has empowered poor families. Charters have freed schools from the tyranny of teachers' unions and elected school boards, and the accountability movement has improved the quality of education in America. And according to the opposing narrative, a market-style approach to education has terrorized poor families. Charters are fundamentally anti-democratic and corporate in their orientation, and the accountability movement has destroyed the quality of public education in America. And I think what I found in my years immersed in New Orleans schools challenged both of those narratives at times. And so first, I want to briefly summarize the structural changes in the New Orleans schools post-Katrina for those who might be less familiar with the background. In the months after the flood, there were two main decisions that set the stage for the current environment. Number one, the school board fired all of the teachers, who were predominantly middle-class African Americans, effectively ending collective bargaining and paving the way for a post-union environment where teachers are employed at will, and some principals liberally fire teachers who do not conform to their expectations. And number two, the state legislature significantly expanded the Recovery School District in a way that transferred most of the schools out of the hands of the locally elected school board and into the hands of the state, whose leaders had the intent of chartering them as quickly as possible. And while the chartering of the city schools occurred more slowly than some had anticipated and hoped, today more than 80% of New Orleans public school children attend charters, and in all likelihood that will grow to between 95 and 100% within the next few years. The net effect of these two big shifts is that you've enormously empowered principals and these sort of private boards that run charters, at least for as long as they can keep their jobs in their schools, to hire, to fire, to adopt curriculum, to change curriculum, to set the school calendar, and to do just about whatever else they see fit. And much of the discussion and debate about public education reform in New Orleans and nationally is rightfully focused on subjects like charter schools and Teach for America and teachers' unions. But I would argue that one of the things that most sets apart the New Orleans school landscape and what threatens or promises, depending on your point of view, to transform urban education across America more broadly is this idea that ceaseless, unending change is what underperforming public school systems most need. It's what some researchers have described as a portfolio approach to governing schools, one where schools like stocks are aggressively bought, sold, and repackaged based on their performance on established metrics. And that's not to say that traditional urban school districts haven't had their share of turmoil and instability, but I think the current way of thinking and approach is fundamentally different. To sort of be critical of both models, I would compare the old New Orleans public school system almost to the military at times in terms of its emphasis on process, tradition, hierarchy, and relationships. And I would compare the current New Orleans public school system to a cross between corporate America and Silicon Valley in terms of its emphasis on flexibility, innovation, youth, and the disposability of human capital. It's a place where the past is often treated with callous disregard. And I think at times sort of the biggest advantages of this model are also the biggest disadvantages, and it's that dichotomy that I'm going to focus on now for a few minutes. The first is that it's much easier for school leaders to make quick and aggressive changes at the classroom level. Under the old system, new superintendents and principals who hoped to make sweeping changes in the classroom sometimes did hit up against this wall of tradition, bureaucracy, and inertia, while under the new system, there really is no such wall. While I was reporting my book, I spent time at one charter school where a principal decided that a teacher wasn't getting the job done, and he told her she had 2 weeks to improve, and at the end of the first week, he decided that her efforts weren't sufficient, and he told her that she could resign or be fired that day. At another charter school, they gave the students an interim assessment that showed that they weren't on pace to pass the social studies and science standardized test exam, so they dropped all of the other subjects from the curriculum for a matter of weeks and triple dosed the students in social studies and science. And as an observer, I had really mixed feelings about both of these decisions, but they matched the mentality of a lot of young school administrators in New Orleans that they need results and they need them right away, and they feel like they're empowered to do whatever it takes to get them. And if you have a smart, insightful, experienced, compassionate school leader who knows what they're doing, that approach works very well. But it can be a total disaster if you have bad, ineffective, inexperienced, or short-sighted leaders. And I've seen both extremes because you have fewer institutional checks and balances in place. Sort of a second example of this dichotomy is that you've broken down kind of the walls that impeded change not only for schools and classrooms, but for families, in that those who can't qualify for a small number of magnet schools are no longer assigned to attend the public school that they're zoned for. For some families, this has been somewhat liberating, and for others, it's been devastating. And you can see this bifurcation within families at different points. For instance, within one of the extended families that I followed for my book, there was a student named Mary who in the middle of her 5th grade year decided that her current school wasn't getting the job done and that she wouldn't be prepared to pass the high-stakes exam that she needed to pass to advance to high school if she stayed there. So of her own volition, she went to the school her stepsister attended over Christmas break and talked the principal into letting her attend there starting that next January. And over the next few years, she grew into one of the school's star students and reached the point where during her 8th grade year, one of her teachers helped her with the application process for a national scholarship that will cover the full cost of her college and graduate school education. But within that same extended family was another student, a young man named Lionel, who was a few years older than Mary, and while also extremely intelligent, he did not have Mary's savvy or extroversion. And not long after Katrina, when he was in the 8th grade, Lionel failed the LEAP test that he needed to pass to go on to high school. And the recovery school district routed him for a school called Booker T. Washington, which they said would help prepare him to pass the LEAP. But which essentially functioned as an alternative program for students who had been expelled or were coming out of incarceration. And Lionel was forced to fight on his first day at Booker T. Washington, and he hated every minute of his time there. But he got out after a year and enrolled at a school called Frederick Douglass in the 9th Ward. And he liked Douglass a lot more than Booker T. Washington and connected with many of his teachers there. But at the end of his sophomore year and at the very last minute, the Recovery School District decided to close Douglas because of its low test scores, and Lionel was reassigned to a school called Cohen, a school with just the same test score results as Douglas that Lionel did not like nearly as much, which the Recovery School District had not yet found a charter operator for. And Lionel isn't the type of person to complain, but he said around the time that he graduated from high school last spring that Booker T. Washington and Cohen had really taken 3 years out of his life and education. And I don't know how well or not Lionel would have been served under the old school system, but I don't think he would have had to endure all these perpetual moves and school closings and live with the sense that he was always being given the leftovers no one else wanted in a system that was reinventing itself around him. So you can see how, through the story of this one extended family, the new dynamism of the system can be both liberating at moments and also extremely debilitating, and in a Darwinian sense can help the stronger of those who might previously have felt more disempowered but hurt the weaker. And here and elsewhere, I believe that contemporary school reformers have taken too much of a trickle-down approach to improving education for low-income families, and that too many of their efforts target the easiest to reach, the stronger, less disruptive students, younger children, more motivated, savvy families, students without special needs, and those living in moderate but not extreme poverty. The final duality of this new model that's being tested in New Orleans relates very directly to the question of how best to reduce and eliminate poverty in places like New Orleans and Milwaukee. And the approach in New Orleans and other cities with similar changes is now to speedily close schools and fire teachers who are perceived as failing poor children. The mentality that is that if X teacher or X school can't get them ready for college and the state standardized exams, then we'll find somebody else who will. And I think on the one hand, whatever your views on standardized testing, you know, there is something necessary about this intolerance of schools that do at a basic level not prepare generation after generation for the kind of work that they'll encounter in college, and that view themselves as engines of social mobility. And in a society as deeply unequal as ours, there's little question you want as many institutions and people working on the front lines who fundamentally view themselves as anti-poverty agents. But there is also something really destructive about this mentality if it leads to a situation where schools alone are expected to lift children out of poverty. I guess we're going back to my premise of constant change, where the solution to our combined healthcare and criminal justice and nutrition and housing and welfare woes becomes simply close the school and fire the teachers. And it's this notion that by rearranging schools and educators like widgets, you can solve American society's most pressing and complicated problems. And I really wish that the ideologues on all sides of the debate over education reform and sort of the people who are the staunchest backers of the two narratives I mentioned in the beginning were forced to talk to both families, of which there are hundreds in New Orleans, who felt underserved and neglected by a stagnant traditional education structure for decades, and also families, of which there are also hundreds in New Orleans, who've in the last few years seen their children bounced from school to school like stocks being moved to a new portfolio. And I feel like only through those conversations can we learn that we need to expect and demand more of our public schools without expecting and demanding everything.
And now I think you understand why we invited these two women. I don't think anybody speaks as cogently about the complexities. You know, it's not just about a rant. It's not about being just angry. It's about figuring out all of how all these moving pieces are operating. I don't know how, Mark, how you want to handle the Q&A? I imagine you want to catch people's voices, so.
Yes, and we need to use the microphone because we're recording for this last night.
Okay, so we're happy to take some questions. Raise your hand, Mark will get to you
Hello.
with the, there you go, right there.
Can I sit? My name is Anna, and I live here in Madison, and I'm a parent of 3 children, 2 with special needs. And one thing that I've found out about the Milwaukee School Choice Program is that while MPS, the Madison Public School System, enrolls about 20% of their children have special needs, within the School Choice Program, only 2% of the children are identified as having special needs. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about what you've seen in New Orleans in the Recovery School District, if the same type of discrimination is taking place there as well.
Yes, can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
Special needs has been a huge issue in New Orleans. And, you know, as both Barbara and I have said, you can't really generalize when it comes to either traditional schools or charter schools, and there are some charters that have high percentages of students with special needs and others who have next to none. But overall, the charters serve significantly fewer students with special needs, and particularly when it comes to more severe needs, like autism and students who have no mobility and who have severe cognitive impairments. And so I think as the non-charter schools kind of disappear one by one, that's a big issue for the city moving forward, is where are those kids going to go? And there hasn't really been a centralized student tracking system in New Orleans, which has been very problematic. I mean, when I was reporting one story for the newspaper, I was out going around with a charter operator that was canvassing a neighborhood looking for potential 5th graders to enroll at their school. They were starting with just 5th grade. And we came upon a household where I think the young man he would have been in 7th grade, but his mother had kept him out of school for 2 years. He was autistic because she didn't feel like there was any that he felt safe in and that she felt safe for him in. So I think there are kids like that who are falling through the cracks, and I think that one of the problems in New Orleans is that it's been so decentralized that there has been kind of no way of catching these families and of sort of working to empower them to know their rights and know that the schools do have to serve them.
Barbara, you want to speak to that at all? Okay.
Hi, I'm Regina, and my question is that our conversation about charter schools has been really polarized. That if you go to some conferences, it'll all be about social justice and the bad charter schools, and if you go to other conferences, it's all about neoliberal advocacy for charter schools. And I'm wondering how we can begin to frame the discussion in a way that isn't so polarized, so that we can look at issues of equity, but also look at issues of reform, if you have ideas for that.
Well, I'll try. That's a very, very good question, because people sometimes will say to me, vouchers, charters, what's the difference? And I say, well, the biggest difference is that vouchers are inherently defined as private. Charters are defined as public. But within that, and Sarah explained this very well earlier, there's a continuum of charter schools. And there are some charter schools that are very faithful to this original vision of, listen, let's experiment, let's figure out what works, and let's use it to improve all schools. And they came with the vision of social justice and of community involvement. But when I say the charter school movement has become, the movement is different from many of these schools, you know, one of the things I tell people is follow the money. And if you look at who are the major foundations and the major funders of charter schools, it's pretty frightening, and I'll explain why. I was up in Green Bay maybe 3 weeks ago. Parents had invited us up to talk about vouchers and charters. And they said that the week before, John Gard, representing the Americans for Prosperity, had been up in Green Bay twice. Now, John Gard is one of 3 former Republican Assembly speakers who's now working as a lobbyist for the school charter and voucher movement. Americans for Prosperity, interestingly, they spent more money against Tammy Baldwin than any other Senate race last fall. This is David Koch, Tea Party, Marketplace. They don't believe in climate control. And I'm saying to myself, why is the Americans for Prosperity so involved in the charter movement? Why is Betsy DeVos and the American Federation for Children so involved in the charter movement? And again, follow the money, because there are different types of charters. But one of the clear strategies of what I would call the more Republican-controlled, at least they're really pushing these in more Republican-dominated legislatures, is to have these statewide boards that are appointed. Now, one of the things, and I'm going to go off a little bit here, but it's one of the things I realized after November. You know, in Wisconsin with the voter ID, people realized that there was an attempt to undermine the right to vote. Now, it's not like they were going to completely take away the right to vote, but to undermine it and make it more difficult. And then I saw what was going on with some of the charter school, where basically removing it from locally elected school boards to appointed boards. And it wasn't so much as if they were removing the public schools and the public institution, completely privatizing it, but they were removing it from a realm of more direct, more democratically controlled accountability. So one way of undermining the democratic right to vote is to just take public institutions and make them less democratic. And that fundamentally is my concern about where some of the charter school movement is heading. And it's not because I have this big, like, wow, democracy, it's the greatest thing in the world. No, it's because historically, public schools have been an arena of struggle because they are public schools. When they're private schools, your right to protest, your right to struggle is undermined. If you're a student, you can get kicked out. If you're a parent, you have no democratic control over that private school. That's why it's called private.
I think Barbara made a really good point when she talked about the fact that the origins of the charter movement, and I think they get totally lost. Albert Shanker is the person who really said, this is what we need to have. And his initiative or his impetus for this was that he felt that teachers were drowning under all of these draconian rules and all of this bureaucracy, and that they needed the freedom to create. And now we see that in some ways the whole idea is kind of spiraled out of control, and nobody even remembers that Albert Shanker had anything to do with charter schools. Yes.
Thinking of sort of the polarization of the debate right now, I think one of the main things that can be done is to get more voices of educators and families in different arenas and in the conversation. And I mean, I think sort of Teach for America and teachers' unions and charter schools, they're all important issues that we need to be talking about, but I just think your average family isn't sitting there thinking, is Teach for America good or bad, or are teachers' unions good or bad? What they care about are their relationships and the daily experiences that their kids are having in the schools. And I think one of the things, just over the course of reporting the book, that struck me is so much of the sort of public and elite debate about public education is framed in these very ideological terms, but a lot of sort of the grassroots tensions are really sociological ones about sort of what kind of education parents of different backgrounds and life experiences prefer for their kids. And so I think the more that we can get the voices of the people working in the schools and the people being served by the schools in the conversation, the better.
All right, my name is Alyssa, and I am a proud Madison La Follette graduate. I also went to the UW-Madison here and graduated in 2008, and I am a close friend with Aiden Kelly. I am very excited that you are here. I did Teach for America in New Orleans and was a public school educator, and I'm very proud of my experience and my core members that I worked with who worked in all sorts of charter schools across New Orleans district. And I really appreciate your writing in that you really gave it the public an eye into what it is like for the life of the children, the families, and teachers especially. I really resonated with Aiden's experience. I'm now back in grad school and saw that you were coming, but I am looking to go to a charter school and interviewed with Sci Academy yesterday. And I'm kind of just curious in your take of holding teachers accountable, because I've noticed in Wisconsin everybody is so scared of holding teachers accountable in terms of test scores solely, and that test scores alone aren't enough to show the big picture of what a classroom looks like, which I agree with. But how can we hold teachers accountable and ensure that schools and classrooms are changing so that kids aren't getting lost and kids aren't being failed and not getting the education we get? Do you have another way of kind of evaluating teachers?
That's a great question, and one that I wish I had the answer to. I mean, I guess my initial sense was that it just needs to be more holistic, and I think that in Louisiana, where I'm most familiar with the dynamic, they created that system really, really quickly, and that it is too simplistic and too reliant solely on test scores, and just to try and figure out in a couple of months how you're going to measure sort of a art teacher's students or a phys ed teacher's students on a very metrics-dominated type scale, I think has been problematic. But that said, I agree that there does need to be some type of measurement. I just think it needs to be much more holistic and needs to be more qualitative than the current system is. Do you have?
Very good question. Just taking another tack, I think that just as the evaluation of teachers needs to be more holistic, I think the evaluation of schools needs to be more holistic. And one of the battles we're having in Milwaukee is over art and music, over playgrounds. I mean, we found out that a lot of the newer schools, which were almost overwhelmingly charter and voucher schools because we had a strong public school system with beautiful buildings, the sort of German heritage of craftsmanship was amazing in some of the Milwaukee public schools. But a lot of the newer schools, they didn't even have playgrounds. So oddly, and this is where it's kind of gotten out of control, people found out that the way to make sure that the new voucher and charter schools had playgrounds, you had to go to the city zoning commission, because the city zoning commission was in charge of what would be the building requirements for new schools. So I think part of what we need to do is ask, what do we expect of our schools? What do we as parents and community people expect of our schools? Do we expect art and music? Do we expect recess? Do we expect gym? Do we expect a second language? These are things that we need to start asking and start demanding, and not just sort of say, well, okay, their test score looks good. Because as everyone knows, if you want a really good school, you control the students you let in. I mean, that's kind of this age-old 101 education. But we need to make sure what are the requirements for all schools, and it's something that we as parents and community people, we can't leave it just up to the teachers.
I think the scary part for those of us in higher education is that we are beginning to see that generation who are NCLB K-12 folks in our classrooms, and they can't write, they cannot think, but they can take a standardized test. And so, I mean, I think the fundamental question we want to keep asking ourselves is, you know, education for what? What is it we're trying to produce?
I have a really, my name is Carol, hi. I have a really specific question for Barbara about the Wisconsin situation. So the really specific and then a bit broad, but I know that the Wisconsin Association of School Boards was at the Capitol last Wednesday lobbying legislators and asking for the voucher expansion to be halted and, you know, basically a reversal of Scott Walker's agenda that's tucked into that budget. And I think of that organization as being a little more conservative, as Wisconsin school boards as being more frequently stacked with Tea Party members, especially in rural areas. They've got the tools, in quotes, to dismantle unions, et cetera. So did you see that as a change or a surprise, or how did you perceive that?
I think there's been a huge change in the voucher debate. I mean, we've had vouchers in Milwaukee since 1990, and around the state, I'd go talking around the state, I couldn't get anyone interested because it was like, oh, that's Milwaukee. And, you know, there's issues of race between Milwaukee and the state, not just within the Milwaukee region. Mm-hmm. And there was a big sort of, well, we're not big, bad Milwaukee. And, you know, you go to some of the smaller towns, you go to some of the smaller and medium-sized schools, cities. The schools are an integral part of the community. I mean, when their basketball team comes here to Madison, I mean, everyone knows what happens. I mean, the Division I high school basketball finals, they're like one of the biggest things on TV, one of the biggest things in the state. So all of a sudden you have these people in these smaller cities and smaller towns, and they go, well, wait a minute, we don't want to be like Milwaukee. And so there's some, there's some balking, and I think it's a very healthy discussion.
And then the bigger question is, Scott Walker said he'd modify his plan, but he didn't say, I would perhaps remove that expansion. Can you give us, look in your crystal ball and say what hope we might have for change?
Crystal ball is that we won't know until that bill is passed and signed, because as everyone knows, the Wisconsin legislature is infamous for those 2 a.m. decisions that people don't find out about until the bill is signed. So my only advice is, boy, just like I tell my children, if there's something you care about, you never, ever, ever take your eye off the ball.
I think you had a question way in the back.
So I have two questions. Something not really off topic, and I'm not. The questions are not to attack the debate today, but I want to know first, how much of an impact does a stable home have on test scores, which determine a school's performance? And anyone can answer that one. And I have a second question as well. How much of an impact does a stable home have on test scores, which determine a school's performance?
Well, I guess I get to get first dig at that, and then Sarah. Well, I don't look at so much as stable and unstable, because I'm not quite sure always what that means. I grew up in an Irish Catholic family of 6 kids. I lived in New York. I kind of like a little bit of dysfunctionality. And so, my home, wow, could I have ever called it stable? But I do think, and this is something different, and that is that when you look at test scores, and again, this is just test scores, and Gloria, boy, she's probably the expert on this, one of the biggest determinants of who's going to do well on the test scores is what they call the BMW effect. Mm-hmm. And the first time someone told me this, I thought, BMW, I had no clue. And they said, how many BMWs are in the driveways? Right. And then you can figure out probably how those kids will do on the test. And one of my concerns is in Milwaukee, at least when people talk about stable and unstable, and we have lots of code words in Milwaukee, and that usually means poor families and black families are unstable and white suburban families are stable. And as someone who grew up in a white suburb, was a single parent for a while, my kids went to Milwaukee Public Schools, a lot of my nieces and nephews went to these, really fancy-dancy suburban affluent schools. I once told my husband that if he made me move to the suburbs, he would have to buy a case of Valium. Now, I probably shouldn't admit this, but I think not all suburban schools are all they're cracked up to be in terms of what kids are truly learning, and nor are a lot of urban schools as bad as they're cracked up to be in terms of what kids are truly learning. So boy, I'm sorry, I didn't really answer your question, I apologize, but I just wanted to try and bring up some of the issues surrounding that question, or I hope I did.
Yeah, and I would just say that there's a danger of correlation. Because if I wanted to say the school to stay out of, I would stay out of a white suburban school because I would be shot to death in it, right? If you look at the data, all the school shootings, they're not happening in Milwaukee or Philadelphia or New Orleans. School shootings happen in nice suburban, stable communities. So we have to be really careful about the danger of correlating things and assume that there's a cause and effect. What we do know is that we can predict school scores by zip codes. And that's just wrong. That's just wrong. That just because you live in this particular community, you're less likely to get a good education. That's the thing I think we're trying to get at.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you're absolutely right to point out that most school shootings are are in white suburban schools. I do think there is, for instance, at one of the schools I was following for the book right before state standardized test season, there was a murder of a very popular alum at that school, which was not on the school grounds, but totally traumatized for obvious reasons that school community. So I do think you're right that kids in low-income communities often live under stresses that kids in wealthier communities don't. But I think the thing that I would emphasize is that I think it's a myth that low-income parents don't care as much about their kids' education or aren't as strong advocates for their kids. And in some ways, among the families I followed, they were even stronger advocates, just because they knew how much was at stake for their kids in not getting it right.
And for my second question, if, I don't know, I think maybe one out of three of you all maybe agreed that an unstable home has an effect on test score performance. But if you kind of will follow me for the second question, if the public schools get the resources that they need, how can issues at home or wherever in the neighborhood be addressed, or is it the school's responsibility to address these issues? It's just kind of what you guys think.
Let me take a stab at that, because I think the greatest stability that we can give to families is a living wage. When we went to W-2, moving people off of welfare in Wisconsin, what they found was that kids' performance went up not when their mothers went to work, but when their mothers got better jobs, because the better jobs meant more income, and those better jobs meant more reasonable hours, not working up in a casino in the middle of the night, so that they had more both discretionary income and discretionary time. So if what you mean by, for me, stability is that you have a stable income, that you know you're going to have enough money to pay your bills and take care of your family. We certainly know that that correlates with better school performance. You got some back there, Mark?
Hello, I'm Utve. I'm a graduate student here.
I'm Brandon. I'm a grad student here as well.
All right, so I think we all agree that standardized test scores probably are not the best way to measure a school's performance, but do you guys have an opinion of what you think? Because I think you alluded to the fact that students that perform well on standardized exams don't necessarily know the material. So what do you think is a good measure of a school performance, your opinion?
Well, you know, we're actually going to have a panel on the Finnish schools, and they don't, you know, everybody's decided they're the best schools in the world. They don't do a bunch of standardized testing. They test on the two international measures that everybody wants them to test on, but they're not constantly testing their students. What they do is pick the best and brightest to be teachers, pay for them to be teachers all the way through graduate school, and leave them alone. Now, that's from their mouth. I mean, they pretty much say we have confidence in the people that we have hired because we've made a selection for really, really good people. So other systems, and I started out my remarks by saying we tend to navel gaze and we're so concerned about what's happening here, but this is a worldwide phenomenon of concern about schools, and that there are other systems throughout the world that are using other measures and not putting all the bets are not on a high stakes exam. That exams are a part of a picture. Even here at the university, we don't put everything on your ACT score. We wouldn't dream of admitting people that way because we'll miss some terrific candidates if all we do is focus on that one test.
Wisconsin has 426 school districts, which in one way, should allow us to get a better feel for what's going on in terms of individual school districts, and therefore be able to compare the top, however one wants to evaluate them, with the bottom. And that might be beneficial in many ways, because you have this difference. Obviously, there are schools that everybody says, yeah, that's a really good school. And then you say, okay, and that these schools are not as good for whatever those reasons are. And then you begin to look at those and compare them and try to figure out why that is the case.
You know, I'm not sure if I'm speaking to the point you were making, but I guess what I took out of it is I feel like in assessing sort of education and sort of all sorts of social policy in this country, there's too much of a look for sort of sole causations, and that oftentimes that there's a myriad of kind of factors that produce any result, and there's too much of a tendency to say, oh, you know, test scores are going up because they're a all charter district or because they have no charters on the other hand. And so I think anybody who says that a specific educational outcome comes only from one and one factor alone is being really misguided, kind of no matter what side of the issue they're on. Does that address the point you were making, or?
Well, because I think you can actually look at two systems of good and bad, however one wants to find them, and begin looking at the differences, and sometimes you can find what the issue is. You know, in the time gone by, cholera was an airborne disease by everybody in the whole world. Mm-hmm. And yet one person said, gee whiz, I don't see it that way.
I guess what I'm saying is, yes, I'm not saying you can't sort of compare and make judgments about what's leading someplace to work and what's not, but I think it's a little bit too much led to this silver bullet type mentality. You know, that if we just bring in this, or if we just do this, then we'll get those same results. And I think that's been part of the problem with the approach to education reform over the last couple of decades, is it is this very silver bullet driven mentality.
Yes, I actually would like to add a question that follows on that a bit. I'll take advantage of the fact that I have the microphone in my hand. I'm curious about the momentum behind a lot of these changes, and especially here in Wisconsin, where you have a tremendous sort of ideological agenda that is not terribly interested in actual evidence about what is or is not working in the Milwaukee voucher program. Evidence has in fact come back that it's not working very well, or it's very uneven, or very disparate results. But a highly ideological agenda is sort of oblivious or indifferent to that kind of evidence. And then there's another dimension of it as well, which is, for example, in the testing industry, when you create a large emerging industry or private powerful corporate interests that are linked to producing and scaling and assessing those tests, then you create tremendous vested interests in sustaining that system, even if the evidence coming back from that testing is weak or poor. So how do you counter the ideological nature of that agenda and the emerging, frankly, corporate power that is driving a lot of this forward?
Well, if we had the complete answer, we probably wouldn't have Act 10. But anyhow, the point you raised, though, that there's an agenda that's not always fact-based, and I remember this was right after Scott Walker announced his budget. And I'm watching TV at night, and it's kind of late, and I hear Scott Walker say, well, we need to expand vouchers because we have all these failing schools in the public schools. And I said, I said to my husband, wait, did I hear that right? Because for the last 10 years, we've defined failing schools based exclusively on test scores. And it is a fact, it is not opinion, it is fact that based on those test scores, the voucher schools are not as good as the public schools in Milwaukee. So now we still have Scott Walker using the failing schools rhetoric to label the public schools and say that's why we need vouchers? And so, it is hard. It really is hard when you have this problem when people can kind of say whatever they want and it's not necessarily based in fact. And one of the reasons I get so upset about vouchers and pretty upset about some of these privately run charters is I'm a journalist. I believe in open meetings and records. Because while I don't think facts will necessarily solve the problem, you have to have facts. And one of my eternal frustrations is that it's damn hard to get what's really going on in a lot of these voucher and charter schools. Because they don't have to report, the voucher schools don't have to abide by open meetings and records. They do not even have to legally report their student demographics. And some of the charter schools aren't a whole lot better. I looked at one of the charter schools, there was a report to the Common Council in Milwaukee, which nominally oversaw this charter school. It was a 500-page report. Yeah, I was a little bit bored one day. I downloaded it and I printed it up, and I'm reading through this 500-page report. And this was on a charter school that was started by a strong proponent of vouchers and charters, always talking about, I care about kids, and I don't doubt him for a minute. But I looked in between sort of the bottom line footnote, 16% of that charter school's students were expelled the year before. And this is a school that went around talking about their wonderful graduation rates, and I'm going, well, of course, if you kick out 16% of your students every year, of course you're going to have a great graduation rate. So there's a problem that we don't have the data lots of times. And then when we do, people seem to ignore it. But, I guess I'm an eternal optimist. You just keep trying to state the truth. The truth, I must admit I have difficulty with the word the truth. But you try and state the facts.
I don't have really all that much to add, but another sort of motivation in the book in following people is I had gotten so frustrated by the way that the data in New Orleans was twisted, and I kind of left my gig reporting for the daily newspaper with the idea that people could sort of take the same set of data and make opposite statements and claims, and that was just sort of happening over and over again. And I know that sort of following people is inherently anecdotal, but to me that was just sort of in that context the only way I felt like I could offer something that really had legitimacy.
The lady up there on my left mentioned about climate change. Well, literally. We should read a book called The Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein. Have you ever heard of it? Please read it. It tells about the capabilities of people in power. Perversion is well amongst those that possess absolute power. Okay. I put myself on the line when I mention this because, and I don't eat Valium, all right? And it's really out in far west end of town. But man has the capability today, literally, to change events. This book tells about the events that people go about for their own benefit, for economics. We're dealing with humans, I'm included, that are mischievous, manipulative, controlling, devious. That's the nature of us. And we got to be aware of it, as you say, what's coming down the pipe. Now, I was out in an area called Indiana, Logansport, and I noticed out there, outside the Grissom Air Force Base, there's these high-altitude fighters that were jettisoning canister up into the stratosphere. And this is my opinion, and I happen to train some binoculars on the sound of the area of the canister. I saw a report of chemicals in that area. I'm saying prior to Katrina, you ought to think on this, the ability of man to do what they can with power. Prior to Katrina, they were seeding the African area for the hurricanes where they birth, okay? And then it got involved in that particular year, not only Katrina, there was a cessation of hurricanes one after another, if you just look into it. And this was brought on because the motive, get our mind, there was a debate about going in Iraq, the change of events.
Sir, I don't mean to interrupt, but I think there were some people who wanted a question about education.
Okay, I'll finish with this. Okay, Well, what came about was Katrina, and the minds were off about the debate of going to Iraq, and they got their will.
Okay.
I think that was a statement.
My name is Carrie Modavilef. I'm the current president of Madison Teachers, and thank you for doing this. And my question tonight is for all of us, as the debate is so polarized, when we know the majority of the community members, the majority of the teachers, and the majority of the families have the majority of our beliefs overlapping, how do we lead and bring the conversation back to one through which we can protect our local control in our school boards, protect our private sector services, and we can become the loudest voice as one together? Have you seen it happen? Where are you seeing this, where communities come with their overlapping interests to be the voice for change?
A U.S. example? No, I don't mean that. I didn't mean that. But we have a very polarized country right now, and I do think we're at one of those historical moments where exactly where things will go, it's not clear. It really isn't, and I really wish I had the answer. And the only thing I can, in my book, I talked to some women from the, open housing protests in Milwaukee in 1960s, and they kind of, some of them looked at me like, you guys marched for a month up in Madison. Ha! They marched 200 consecutive nights throughout the winter into 20 below temperatures. So, there really only is a message. If there's something you believe in, you just have to keep on doing it, keep on saying, keep on believing, keep on trying, and you can't give up. But I don't have any magic answers. Anyone else here got like the inspiring, this is, the path to nirvana and glory?
What happened in New Orleans, the changes really did they were very top down, and there was not much community input, if any. But I guess one thing I would say is that since then, there have been sort of isolated examples of coalitions of parents and sometimes with teachers really coming together maybe to create a school that is more grassroots in its orientation. And even though they might seem like kind of the exceptions and like isolated cases, I think over time those do add up. And they might not sort of be transforming kind of the debate or the system or the approach, but just, I guess I just wouldn't hesitate to fight a fight just because it seems like a small one, or because I think over time that big fights kind of start with little ones.
We got one more question.
My name is Dustin Schallert. I recently got my teaching degree here from UW-Madison. So charter schools and the voucher schools have the freedom to experiment a little bit more outside the box versus what public schools can do. But then the big disadvantage that you guys talked about tonight is the lack of transparency and oversight and lack of democracy in the process. Is there any way that public schools can have more freedom to step outside the traditional education paradigm and find ways to meet students in areas that are that are not doing well? Can they gain that same flexibility and ability to experiment?
Well, we'll let Sarah get on this. I mean, one sort of easy answer is, well, that's what the original charter school movement was all about. But the other thing that people sometimes forget about Milwaukee is that, the desegregation movement was very complicated. One of the faults and problems was that it put the burden of desegregation completely on the African American community. Clear, absolute, utterly wrong. At the same time, as part of what they wanted to have as a sort of voluntary desegregation magnet school, different names people had, they actually developed a very interesting array of schools. We had Montessori schools, environmental schools, art schools, bilingual schools. So within that public school system, there was a huge array of choices and options and different types of schools. So I think part of it, again, is really parents and communities saying to their local school boards, what do we want our schools to be? And if we want schools that will have some more flexibility and some more options, then you have to demand it. And I think I've seen it. It can happen. So that would be sort of a brief answer to what, again, is yet another. You guys have good questions here tonight. They're really complicated.
I don't have much to add to what Barbara said. I mean, in 12 years covering urban school districts, though, I would say, you know, within a traditional structure, I've seen principals who create sort of wonderful, innovative programs that are kind of going on their own mold. So I wouldn't say that traditional structures always kind of stymie or serve as an impediment to that kind of creative approach. And I guess just thinking about the whole issue of democracy in education, I think that, you know, just because you have sort of an elected school board, that does not necessarily mean you have sort of all of the voices you need in the public education debate. And I think no matter what the model is, whether or not it's a traditionally elected school board or what you have in New Orleans now, there just needs to be more of a priority placed on getting the perspectives of the families the schools are serving and getting them to come out to school board meetings or involving them in the kinds of conversations about what sorts of charters they want for their kids.
Can we give a big round of applause
Thank you.
to Sarah and Barbara? Mark, you have
Yes.
any final remarks?
Just one last thing. I think the remarkable thing, of course, what we really wanted to accomplish tonight, and I really appreciate you all coming. In the United States, we have remarkable, brilliant educational research. Frankly, we have incredible experiments in many schools, in many states, and in very unlikely places. Remarkable innovations in STEM, in sustainability, in the arts. What is missing often is connecting, is really, really good, engaged, passionate journalism that communicates both the research and what's happening in the schools to a broader public. So that's precisely what we hope to accomplish tonight. I want to thank you all for coming. There are books for sale by all the authors in the back, and you have a chance to talk to them in the back. Thank you again.